David, in perhaps a moment of poor consideration, believes this storyline from Ziba and then gives him all of Mephibosheth's land. Is what is more likely. We'll find out what more likely happens is just as Mephibosheth says, that he had instructed Ziba to saddle donkeys, to take both of them. Ziba had disappeared and had gone ahead to meet David and left Mephibosheth behind. And there is some evidential support to that story in the fact that here comes Ziba showing up with 2 saddled donkeys, whereas if Mephibosheth had really said, I'm going to stay here and wait for Absalom, who will name me king of Israel, there would have been no need to saddle 2 donkeys. So in all likelihood, Ziba here is taking advantage of a confusing situation. We see a lot of this happen. People will take advantage of a crisis to promote themselves. And that is precisely here what I believe Ziba does in this event. David, though, then leaves. He leaves from Jerusalem, and it says here in verse 5, when King David came to Bahurim, behold, there was a man who came out of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. We talked about this a little bit last week. He got down to this section a little bit, just barely to touch on it. We find out, frankly, from this, that David was not like universally popular. No ruler, I suspect, ever is universally popular. And David had his enemies as well. And so here comes this man, Shimei, the son of Gera, and he came out cursing continually as he came. And he threw stones at David and all the servants of King David and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and his left. And thus Shimei said when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. And the Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom, and behold, you are taken away in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed. And so, again, we see this man. We discussed how this may be the fellow who's described as Cush the Benjamite, described in Psalm 7. And if we go and look at that psalm, I think we looked at it a little bit last week. I'm not sure we really got into it very far, but there it is. Says, my Lord, in thee I have taken refuge. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there is none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is injustice in my hands, if I have rewarded evil to my friend, or I have plundered him who without cause was my adversary, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it. You have to understand what Shimei is accusing David of, the crimes that he's committed. He undoubtedly sees David as either directly or indirectly responsible for the death of Saul. He would have seen David as directly or indirectly responsible for the death of Jonathan. And that would have hurt David. You think about it, that would have hurt David. David had been very loyal to Saul. David had been very protective of Saul, and he had especially been protective and loyal to Jonathan. He and Jonathan were best friends. And to have this man come out and accuse him of conspiring, or at least abetting with the death of Jonathan, that would have hurt. That would have hurt him to have been accused of such a crime. And David, of course, he may have also seen him as guilty for the death of Abner, because certainly Joab had killed Abner. He had murdered Abner in a very treacherous way, and David had done nothing to Joab. And so certainly that is going to weigh on him. And this fellow may have also seen him responsible, or at least abetting, the death of Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son, who, of course, again, was murdered. Now, David, of course, did put to death his murderers, but once, once you get into a pattern of accusing somebody of great crimes, why, it's easy to kind of heap up all kinds of crimes to them. And we begin to imagine that they are guilty of all sorts of things. And so here is this Shimei, who is obviously no friend of David's, no supporter of David's, and who's coming out cursing him and throwing stones at him, which was a sign of, we might understand it as a sign of deep disrespect. I mean, this was, we have seen people in our own time, in our own political time, who would throw, rotten fruit or rotten vegetables at politicians, or try to hit them with, a pie or something silly like that as a means. It's a disrespect. It's an attempt to shame them. It's an attempt to insult them. And we see the same thing for here. Shimei is determined to insult David in this way, and sees him as responsible, like I said, for the death of all these people. And like I said, I would imagine this would hurt David, because again, David had a great deal of respect for Saul. He had a great deal of love and affection for Jonathan, and to be accused of being complicit in their deaths, why, it would have been a hard thing to take. Verse 9, then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head. You see, here is that family. We talked again a little bit about this last week. Here is that family of Zeruiah. Joab, of course, is one part of this family, and Abishai is part, and so was the younger brother, who is Asahel. I have to think of his name for a minute. If you recall, he was the one who was pursuing after Abner and would not give up that pursuit, and Abner ultimately turned and killed him. He was so hot-headed. And so here are these other two hot-headed men, Joab, known for his hot temper, and Abishai, also known for a hot temper. And he's saying, well, I'll just go over and kill this guy. He's made me mad. He's insulted you. I'm just going to go over and kill him. The king said, what, O sons of Zeruiah? If he curses and the Lord has told him, curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so? David's going, wait a minute. You don't know why he's doing this. You don't know. You assume you know everything about this man's background. You don't know that perhaps God has been in contact with him. God has suggested to him, you go curse David, and he's just simply doing what God told him to do. And so we see David takes a little more rational approach to things. Even in a moment of crisis, David tries to take a little more rational. He's realizing, hey, we got more than enough troubles than to worry about this guy. As he points out here, he says, verse 11, then David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my son who came out of me seeks my life. How much more this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of cursing this day. And so, I got bigger problems than this guy. My own son is trying to kill me. My own flesh and blood is trying to seek me out and kill me. I'm not going to worry about this guy. And so David says, David and his men went on the way, and Shimei went along on the hillside parallel with him, and he went down and cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. And all the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary, and he refreshed himself there. And so they they come then to a resting place as they're traveling along. This was this would have been undoubtedly on the west bank of the Jordan, somewhere on the west bank of the Jordan. They find a place to camp, find a place to set up, and they're going to gather intelligence now and find out what's going on. We see that then Absalom then arrives in Jerusalem. Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And they came about when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king, long live the king." And Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty, your friend? Why do you not go with your friend?" Then Hushai said to Absalom, "No, for whom the Lord, this people, and all the men of Israel have chosen, his shall I be, and with him I will remain. And behold, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so I will be in your presence." You see Hushai, of course, Hushai has been directed by David to stay behind. You are to stay behind. You are to try and thwart the advice, whatever advice that Ahithophel gives. You're to try and thwart it, and you're to keep me informed. That was the mission that David had given to Hushai. And Hushai wins him a place in the court. You see how he flatters. We see how he flatters Absalom. Absalom, of course, thinks very highly of himself, and so he's very susceptible to flattery. Hushai tells him, first of all, "Hey, aren't you chosen of the Lord? Didn't all of Israel choose you? And didn't the Lord choose you?" That idea of the Lord choosing him, he has no, of course, evidence of that. There's been no prophet that's come. There's been no anointing. He's simply implying it based on the fact that Absalom has won over the hearts of the people and letting Absalom believe that as well. He does know you've been chosen by all the men of Israel. And of course, we know how Absalom did that. Absalom did that by basically buddying up to as many people in Israel as he could and trying to present himself as a better king than his father, even though that was based on no evidence. And so he's going to try and present this idea to them that, yes, I can do better than my father. And so, of course, the men of Israel have chosen him, thinking that, yeah, he might be a better king. He'll give me what I want. He's a populist. We talked about that a little bit last week. He's got this populist message, and he's going to try and deliver this to these folks, and give them this sense of, yes, that he can do a better job than his father. He is initially suspicious, though, of Hushai. We see that. Why didn't you go with my father? I thought you were my father's friend. And, of course, Hushai then flatters him, as we see here. He says, you're your father's son. I served him. Now I'm going to serve you. I'm going to serve whoever's the king of Israel, basically is what he's saying. And so, therefore, again, flattering Absalom by suggesting that he's fully willing to accept him as being king along with everybody else. We find out here, of course, what we're going to see is that here is Absalom, who is going to allow himself to be swayed by Hushai, and in doing so, he's going to not always be following Ahithophel's advice, and we will see in the storyline that if he had followed Ahithophel's advice, this might have turned out a very different circumstance. But what we again will see is the providence of God. God has providentially put this man in this position, Hushai. David, of course, has put him there. But this is all part of God's providence, if you will, that God is going to use Hushai as his instrument to subvert Absalom. They didn't tell him, verse 15. Then Absalom, verse 20. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your advice, what shall we do?" And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father, The hands of all who are with you will also be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. And the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the Lord, of the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded by both David and Absalom. This action on the part of Absalom, first, you notice what Ahithophel suggests. You go into your father's concubines, because that's going to make you despicable to your father. And by doing so, you're going to be basically proving to all of Israel that you have completely severed all ties with your father. There will be no reconciliation between you and your father, and that's going to prove to your followers that, yes, you're determined to overthrow your father. And Absalom actually takes it one step further, because Ahithophel just said, you go in to your father's wives, and all Israel will hear about it. Absalom decides, no, I'm going to do that one better. He sets up the wedding, this tent that he sets up. This, as he says here in verse 22, they pitched a tent for Absalom. This was not just a common, ordinary tent. This was a special tent. This was the wedding tent, where a man would go into his wife. We find this mentioned in a couple of passages in the Old Testament. We find it mentioned in Psalm. This was part of their ceremony. And so if we look at Psalm 19 and verse 5, Psalm 19 and verse 5, he says, back up to verse 4, their line has gone out through all the earth, and their audiences to the end of the earth. He has placed a tent for the sun, in which as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, it rejoices as a strong man to run his course. This idea of the bridegroom coming out of his chamber, coming out of his chamber into the tent. This was part of their marriage ceremony. We see the same thing over in the book of Joel. Here it is. Joel 2 and verse 16. He says there, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and the nursing infants. Let the bridegroom come out of his room and the bride out of her bridal chamber. This was all part of their wedding ceremony. And so Absalom, in order to show, now he's not going to merely let Israel hear about what's happened. He's going to let them see what's happened. He's going to let them see what's taking place. And so he sets up this bridal tent on the roof of the palace where everybody can see it. And he goes into there. He leads the concubines in, and he goes in there to them. It was a great act of disrespect to his father. It was an incredible insult to his father. It was a crime punishable by death. We look over in Leviticus. We see this over in Leviticus, the 20th chapter, and verse 11. It says, if a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. This was an insult. This was more than just simply fooling around. This was a deadly insult to his father. This was a sin that was so detestable. We find out even in the New Testament times, it was so detestable, it was so vile, that as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, that's a sin not even named among the Gentiles, that a man should have his father's wife. And that's what Absalom has done. He has done the most odious thing he can think of to insult his father. He has done that most vile thing he can think of to insult his father. And so by this, he makes reconciliation with Absalom or with David impossible. Interestingly enough, some Bible critics look at this. Now, this was prophesied. If you recall, this was prophesied. If you go back to 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, and look at verse 11. This is, of course, Nathan talking to David, and he says, "Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight." There is that clear prophecy. Well, some Bible critics look at this passage and they say, well, it doesn't mention here that Nathan had this prophecy. Therefore, they draw the conclusion that since it doesn't specifically name Nathan's prophecy here, that Nathan's prophecy back in chapter 12 and verse 11 was a later insert, that this was some sort of later parenthetical insert by some scribe and not in the original text, not in the original utterance from Nathan. Some kind of late addition. Well, this is a silly thing. This is a remarkably silly thing. Anyone with any sense at all can see that, yes, here's Nathan's prophecy, and Nathan's prophecy is absolutely coming true in exact detail, in a very exact detail. And so, the author clearly doesn't have to beat us over the head and say, hey, all this was happening according to Nathan's prophecy. We can tell that it's all happening according to Nathan's prophecy. But again, we get some sense here of the degree to which some of these Bible critics will try and quibble over Bible passages, trying to find fault to make their case. We conclude this chapter. It says it was the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of God. So was the advice that Ahithophel gave regarding David and Absalom. We should understand, in reading that passage, that God here is not endorsing Ahithophel's advice. The fact that Ahithophel has given him advice to go into your father's concubines, in other words, take your father's wives and have sexual relations with them. This was not God is not endorsing that. Indeed, that was completely contrary to the will of God. Rather, there is a recognition here of Ahithophel's cunning. There's a recognition here of Ahithophel's understanding of worldly wisdom. That yes, you want to be rejected by your father. You want to make yourself your father's enemy. Do this thing. That's what's being revealed here. We're not endorsing. There's no endorsement here of Ahithophel's advice as godly, no, but rather just simply recognizing that, if this is what you're trying to accomplish, this will work. This will do the job. If you're trying to really insult your father so that there is no chance for reconciliation, this will take care of it. This will do the job. All right. So from there, then we move in, unless there's questions, we move into chapter 17. Yeah. Of David's sin with Bathsheba, I think it was fairly widely known. David being king, people are going to see who goes in and out of the palace. He's got all these messengers that have gone to find out who is Bathsheba and have brought her back to his palace. They would have known. It's sort of like the president of the United States trying to keep his indiscretions secret. Probably one of the most notable ones I could think of was John Kennedy, who tried very hard to keep a lot of his indiscretions private. But what came out in later years, it came out that, he had a number of indiscretions. He had a number of discreet meetings with various women and various, behaviors like that. And people talk about it. People were talking about it. Yeah. And this, I think it helps contribute to Absalom's popularity. It also contributes to Absalom's behavior because Absalom obviously sees, hey, if dad can get away with it, why can't I? All right. So now now Absalom comes to Ahithophel. It says, furthermore, Ahithophel said to Absalom, please let me choose 12,000 men that I may arise and pursue David tonight. And I will come upon him while he is weary and exhausted. Now, remember, all right, we got to understand something here a little bit on this timeline, okay? It probably took a little while for them to set up the tent and for Absalom to go into these women. So that part is happening later. This part is happening the very night, though, that they arrived in Jerusalem. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in the storyline, or at least in the chronology here. So don't think this is all perfectly sequential. It's not. As Ahithophel says, and I will come upon him while he is weary and exhausted, and I will terrify him, so that all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike down the king alone. And I will bring back all the people to you. The return of everyone depends on the man you seek. Then all the people shall be at peace. And the plan pleased Ahithophel and all the elders of Israel. All right, so he takes his advice. They listen to Ahithophel, comes up with an idea. You give me 12,000 men. You give me 12,000 chosen men, and I'm going after David. I'll go after David. I'll kill David. I'll catch him. I'll kill him, and I'll bring back all the rest of the people, and we'll have peace, because really the only one we care about is David. We're not interested in killing everybody or whole groups of people. We're only interested in deposing David, getting rid of David. Okay? And we can have sort of minimal bloodshed that way. So it sounds pretty good to Absalom and to these men, to these elders of Israel. Yeah, we kind of get things back to normal pretty quickly. All we have to do is get rid of David. Okay? Now, a couple of questions or a couple of comments have come up from some of the Bible scholars who look at this and say, there's Ahithophel may have had, he may have had a card or two he's trying to play. He's got motive. He's got reason here to come up with this plan. If David is dead and Ahithophel, is in command of this army of, 12,000 sort of elite forces, Ahithophel's in a real strong position to sort of dictate how things are going to go. He might even be able to depose Absalom and take over for himself. Is some of the speculation that we see from some of these scholars. And they remind us, these scholars do, this man is the grandfather of Bathsheba, the great-grandfather of Solomon, and he is undoubtedly looking at Absalom and realizing that if Absalom becomes king, if Absalom is king and they are able to capture Bathsheba and Solomon, because obviously Bathsheba and Solomon have gone with David, but if they're able to capture Bathsheba and Solomon are dead, because there's no way Absalom's going to let those two stay alive. They are both possible contenders for the throne. Certainly Solomon is, and Absalom's not going to leave a potential rival. So there may have been a move here by Ahithophel that, hey, I can get rid of David, then I can get rid of Absalom, and I can set maybe Solomon up as king, even though he would have been a child at this point. I could set Solomon up as a king, with me being his regent, his guardian, if you will. And Ahithophel kind of essentially becomes ruler of Israel for a period of time, and keeps this, kind of protects this granddaughter and grandson. And so there is a certain logic here. There is a certain there is a certain logic here of, hey, if I catch David, he's tired, he's on the run, he's tired. If I catch him, I can sweep these other men away pretty quickly, get them to run away. I'll have David alone. I'll capture David. I'll kill him, and we can get things back to normal. He's appealing to Absalom's. There's a little bit of an appeal here to Absalom's lack of experience. There really is an appeal here to Absalom's lack of experience. Absalom doesn't have combat experience the way David does. And so there is that sort of sense that, you really don't want to get into a fight with David. I'll take care of it. We find now, what we find here is Absalom, first of all, he listens to this advice from Ahithophel. He likes the idea. Initially, he likes the idea a lot. He's ready to go. But, as we'll find out here, he quickly changes his mind. He has a real problem, Absalom does. He has a real problem setting up a course of action and then sticking with it. We see something of his lack of experience. We see something of his inability to make up his mind. He's kind of indecisive. Well, this idea sounds pretty good, but then that idea sounds pretty good. So he's indecisive. And, James 1 and verse 8 tells us that double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Well, here's Absalom, who's being double-minded and can't quite make up his mind. So Absalom next goes to Hushai and asks him for advice. And we see Hushai. Now remember, Hushai is in here as a double agent. Hushai is in here pretending to be working for Absalom, but in fact, of course, he's really working for David. And part of his mission was to defeat any advice that came from Ahithophel. So here we find, starting in verse 5, we find here's Hushai's statement. Then Absalom said, "Now call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say." When Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, "Ahithophel has spoken thus. Shall we carry out this plan? If not, you speak." He outlines the plan. Here's the plan I've gotten from Ahithophel. And what do you think? Hushai said to Absalom, "This time the advice of Ahithophel is not good." Moreover, Hushai said, "You know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and they are fierce, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is an expert in warfare, and he will not spend the night with the people. Now, behold, he has now hidden himself in one of the caves or in another place, and it will be that when he falls on them at the first attack, whoever hears of it will say, 'There has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' And even the one who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will completely lose heart, for all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and all who are with him are valiant men. But I counsel that all Israel shall surely be gathered to you, from Dan even to Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea in abundance, and that you personally go into battle. So it shall come to him in one of the places where he can be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all of his men who are with him, not even one will be left. And if he withdraws into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it into the valley until not even a small stone is found there." Then Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for the Lord has ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel in order that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom." And so here comes Hushai. Hushai delivers a masterpiece. This is a masterpiece of subversive advice. This is fairly brilliant. It's a great combination. It's a great combination of eloquence, of logic, and of flattery. Okay, the three great components that are going to really ring a bell, really ring the gong with Absalom. He first points out, "Now, wait a minute," says Hushai, "wait a minute. Your father David, he's a mighty man of war, and the men who are with him are mighty men of war. They're combat skilled. They have real combat experience. And they obviously are not going to be caught in the open, as Ahithophel suggests. They're not going to get caught in the open. They have already probably pulled themselves back into one of these strongholds that David knows about, because you recall, David, of course, had been all over this area when he was being pursued by Saul. And so you can imagine that the Hushai is pointing that out. David knows this ground. He knows this ground very well. He's undoubtedly pulled himself into some kind of stronghold, and the minute you attack, he's going to pounce. He's going to pounce on you, and when he does pounce on you, he's going to take your troops down. And when all Israel hears about that, it's going to be, oh look, Absalom just got whooped badly, and everyone's going to go, wait a minute, maybe Absalom isn't the right guy to lead us. That's going to be the conclusion. Wait a minute, we thought we had a leader in Absalom, but maybe not, because he just got pummeled by his father. He says, I got a better idea. We're going to gather, he says, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba. Now that's the phrase that they typically use in the Old Testament. That phrase, from Dan to Beersheba, was from the extreme north to the extreme south. It meant all of Israel. We're going to gather up all the men, and we're going to put you, Absalom, in charge of this invincible army. We're going to have an army that's going to be so big. It's going to be so big, as he describes it here. I love some of the phrasing he uses here. This idea of he's like a bear robbed of his cubs, and so he's going to be fierce. We know about a bear robbed of its cubs. Even in this day, we know you don't get between a mama bear and her cubs, because that's a good way to get mauled. And so I like that imagery. But I also like the imagery that he says, we're going to gather up all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. And he says in verse 12, we'll fall on him as dew falls on the ground. In other words, we're going to be everywhere all at once. We're going to have this great army, and we're going to be everywhere all at once, and we will have the field. We will have this army. And you, Absalom, will be the head of this invincible army. And of course, he paints undoubtedly this word picture of here's Absalom in the royal robes, seated on a mighty charger, leading his army out to fight David. And giving this picture. And if David tries to run back into a city, why, we'll just take ropes and we'll just drag the entire city into a valley. We'll just drag that whole city into a valley and leave not one stone on another. It's that idea of, well, if you're in charge of this invincible army, you're unstoppable. You are completely unstoppable, and we'll take this over. And we find out here, as he says here, in verse 14, we find the result of this. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. And why? Because the Lord, this is the providence of God. This is right here, the providence of God. Because the Lord has ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel. Ahithophel had the right idea. You need to strike. You need to strike now. You need to hit your father when he's on the run, when he's defensive, and you can win this. But no, Absalom kind of likes the other. He likes this imagery of him being in charge of this force, of him being the lead of the army, of this great army. And so you again see, here's the providence of God, who is using the arrogance, using the ego of Absalom to bring about his defeat. All right, I'm going to stop there. We got about 2 minutes left, but I'm going to stop there. We'll continue on with the rest of chapter 17 next week, and we'll go into chapter 18. Appreciate your attention this morning.